Welcome to a story that still sends chills through the Appalachian Mountains. A true case so disturbing it was nearly erased from local memory. Tonight, we're uncovering the Appalachian brothers who stalked women inside their barn of captives. A real, life nightmare built from court records, witness statements, and forgotten newspaper clippings that took months to piece together. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And if you appreciate deep, fact-based storytelling that digs into real history instead of rumors, make sure you subscribe, because uncovering the truth behind stories like this takes serious time, research, and effort. The region where the brothers lived was the kind of place maps barely bothered to name. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, miles from paved roads and even farther from law enforcement, the land folded in on itself like a secret. Narrow dirt paths twisted through thick forests, disappearing into hollows where sunlight barely touched the ground. Fog rolled in heavy at dawn and dusk, clinging to the valleys as if it didn't want to leave. People who lived there were used to isolation. Neighbors might be miles apart, connected only by rumor, habit, and a long-standing rule of minding your own business. This isolation wasn't accidental. For generations, families had settled these mountains because they wanted distance from authority, from cities, from anyone asking questions. Outsiders were noticed immediately. A strange car on a gravel road could become the subject of conversation for weeks. And yet, paradoxically, what happened behind closed doors or behind trees often stayed hidden. It was a place where people knew airs off each other, but rarely knew airs about each other. That silence became the perfect cover. The brothers' property sat at the end of a barely passable trail, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. From the road, if you could even call it that, all anyone could see was a rundown farmhouse and an old barn slumped into the earth as if it had grown there. The barn looked abandoned, its boards gray and warped, its roof partially collapsed. To a passerby, it was nothing more than a relic of failed farming, common in a region where land was hard to tame and harder to profit from. But that appearance was part of what kept the truth buried for so long. Appalachia in that era was a place where disappearances didn't always raise alarms. People moved frequently, chasing work in coal towns, lumber camps, or drifting from one county to the next. Women traveling alone, especially poor women, were often seen as transient, easy to forget. When someone vanished, the assumption was simple: they moved on. Families didn't always have the means or the influence to push authorities to investigate, and local law enforcement was spread thin across rugged terrain. One missing person rarely seemed connected to another, especially when the landscape itself swallowed people whole. The mountains also carried a long history of folklore and fear. Stories of wild men, mountain devils, and cursed hollows had been told for generations. When strange things happened, screams heard at night, shadows moving near tree lines, people explained them away with superstition. The woods were dangerous, they said. Animals cried like humans. Wind carried sound in strange ways. And so, when whispers began that women were going missing near certain trails, many locals convinced themselves it was coincidence, or the mountains simply taking what they always had. What made the brothers' location especially effective was how ordinary it seemed within its surroundings. Nothing about the place screamed danger. It blended seamlessly into the neglected landscape, another struggling homestead in a poor region. No lights at night drew attention. No noise carried far enough to reach neighbors. The thick trees acted like walls, swallowing sound and sight alike. Even screams, later survivors would say, could vanish just yards into the forest. The brothers understood the terrain intimately. They knew which paths were used by women walking to nearby towns, which shortcuts were taken to save time, and where help was farthest away. In Appalachia, geography isn't just land, it's power, and they used it. The mountains became part of their system, an accomplice that concealed their movements and erased evidence. Tracks disappeared quickly in soft soil and leaf cover. Rivers ran fast after rain. Wildlife scattered remains. The land cleaned itself. Community culture also played a role. People were wary of authorities and even more wary of causing trouble. Reporting suspicions about neighbors could bring retaliation or social exile. The brothers were known, at least in passing, quiet men, kept to themselves, seen occasionally in town for supplies. Being reclusive wasn't unusual there, it was expected. And so, their isolation raised no alarms. In fact, it protected them. Over time, the area earned a quiet reputation. Women avoided certain roads without quite knowing why. Parents warned daughters not to travel alone at dusk. Travelers felt watched but couldn't explain it. Fear spread not as panic, but as instinct, a tightening in the chest when passing a certain bend, a sudden urge to turn back. The land itself seemed to warn people, but warnings without proof are easy to dismiss. It was only later, when survivors spoke and investigators pieced together patterns, that the significance of the location became horrifyingly clear. The isolation wasn't just background, it was the foundation. Without those mountains, those woods, that culture of silence, the brothers could never have done what they did for as long as they did. The Appalachian landscape didn't create the evil, but it hid it, protected it, and allowed it to grow unnoticed. In the end, the region that had once shielded them became a witness. Every trail, every tree line, every forgotten road told the same story, that in places where the world feels far away, darkness can thrive quietly, blending into the landscape until it's almost impossible to see, until it's too late. The brothers' childhood was shaped by neglect, violence, and a kind of emotional isolation that ran deeper than the mountains around them. They were born into a family already marked by poverty and dysfunction, in a house where silence was often safer than speaking and fear was treated like discipline. Their father was known in the area as a hard man, unpredictable, quick to anger, and deeply controlling. Neighbors later recalled hearing shouting late into the night, followed by long stretches of unnatural quiet. Their mother, worn down by years of survival, withdrew inward, offering little warmth or protection. From an early age, the brothers learned that power belonged to whoever could take it, and weakness was something to be punished. As children, they rarely played with others. When they did, it never ended normally. There were reports of animals found mutilated near the woods, where the boys spent their time. Not enough to spark an investigation, but enough to unsettle people who noticed the pattern. Chickens went missing. A dog was found tied and left to starve. When questioned, the brothers either stared silently or smiled in a way that made adults uncomfortable. But in a community where people already struggled to survive, warning signs were often ignored or explained away as boys being boys. School offered no refuge. Teachers later admitted that the brothers showed little emotion, rarely spoke, and reacted strangely to authority. One would sit completely still for hours, eyes fixed on nothing, while the other lashed out without warning. They were fascinated by fear, not their own, but others. A classmate once recalled being locked in a shed as a joke, only to hear the brothers laughing outside while he screamed to be let out. When confronted, they denied everything. No punishment followed. In Appalachia, discipline stayed inside the family, and outside interference was unwelcome. As they grew older, their bond tightened into something unhealthy and closed off. They spent most of their time together, hunting, trapping, and roaming the woods far from adult supervision. Those trips weren't just about survival skills, they were lessons in control. They learned how long it took for an animal to weaken, how silence could be used as a weapon, how isolation broke resistance. Later investigators would say that many of the methods used in the barn mirrored techniques they likely practiced on wildlife for years. Puberty only sharpened what was already wrong. Locals began to notice the way the brothers watched women, not with curiosity, but with ownership. Their stares lingered too long, cold and deliberate. Women in town reported feeling followed, sensing footsteps behind them that stopped when they turned around. Again, nothing concrete, just discomfort. And discomfort, especially when expressed by women, was easy to dismiss. There were moments when intervention might have changed everything. A distant relative once tried to have one of the brothers evaluated after a violent outburst, but the effort went nowhere. Mental health resources were almost non-existent in the region, and the family refused outside help. The boys were pulled further into isolation, taught that the world was hostile, and that taking control was the only way to survive it. Authority figures either failed to notice or chose not to push. Looking back, many would admit they didn't want to know. By the time the brothers reached adulthood, the warning signs were no longer subtle. They were deeply withdrawn, unemotional, and disturbingly calm under pressure. Their relationship with each other became insular, reinforcing twisted beliefs without challenge. There was no moral boundary left intact, only rules they made themselves. Women, in their minds, were not people but objects of control, symbols of power they had never possessed as children. What makes their story so unsettling isn't just what they eventually did, but how clearly the path toward it was marked. The signs were there, in the animals, in the fear of classmates, in the unease of neighbors. But in a place where survival demanded silence and community norms discouraged interference, those signs faded into the background. Evil didn't arrive suddenly in the mountains. It grew slowly, quietly, nurtured by neglect, isolation, and a long line of chances for someone to step in that no one ever took. By the time the brothers disappeared fully into their own world, the damage was already done. The children who learned that pain equaled power became men who believed control was their right. And the mountains, which had hidden their suffering for so long, would soon hide the suffering they inflicted on others. The disappearances didn't begin with screams or police sirens. They began quietly, almost invisibly, the way so many tragedies do in places where distance and isolation blur the line between concern and coincidence. At first, it was just one woman who didn't make it home before dark. She had been seen earlier that afternoon walking along a narrow mountain road, heading toward a nearby town. When night fell and she hadn't returned, neighbors assumed she had stayed with family or found work elsewhere. In Appalachia, people came and went all the time. No one panicked. Then it happened again. Another woman, traveling alone, vanished along a different stretch of road, a shortcut locals often took to save time. A witness remembered seeing her speak briefly with two men near a rusted truck pulled off the path, but the detail didn't seem important at the time. Men broke down on those roads all the time. By the next morning, she was gone. No tracks, no belongings, just absence. As weeks passed, patterns began to form, though no one wanted to name them. The women were often alone. They were usually walking or hitching rides through remote areas. And most chilling of all, the disappearances clustered around certain back roads, paths that wound through thick trees and hollows where sound didn't travel and help was far away. Mothers started warning daughters not to travel after dusk. Shopkeepers noticed familiar faces missing. Fear crept in quietly, like fog rolling down the mountainside. What no one knew at the time was that these roads were not chosen at random. The brothers had studied them for years. They knew where travelers slowed down, where visibility dropped, where a scream would vanish into the trees. They didn't rush. They waited. Survivors would later say that the feeling of being watched came first, a tightening in the chest, the sense that footsteps were matching theirs just out of sight. By the time the women realized they were in danger, it was already too late. Rumors spread through nearby towns, but they were fragmented and inconsistent. One person claimed they heard crying near the woods at night. Another spoke of a woman's scarf found by the river. A third insisted the mountains were cursed. Without bodies or clear evidence, law enforcement had little to act on. Cases were filed separately, scattered across counties, each one treated as an unfortunate but isolated incident. The idea that these vanishings were connected, that someone was hunting, felt too horrifying to accept. The brothers remained invisible in plain sight. They appeared occasionally in town, buying supplies, exchanging brief words with clerks. Their faces became familiar, but not memorable. Quiet men didn't draw attention in Appalachia. Silence was normal. Avoiding eye contact was normal. And so, when women disappeared, no one thought to look toward the men who blended so perfectly into the background. As the months passed, the fear shifted from concern to dread. Women stopped traveling alone altogether. Some towns arranged informal escorts. Others simply stayed home. The roads grew quieter, but the disappearances didn't stop. They just moved farther out, deeper into the backcountry. Each time a woman vanished, the community felt it like a bruise, tender but hidden. People sensed something was wrong, but no one could point to what or who. What made it even more disturbing was the lack of chaos. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence left behind. It was as if the women had stepped off the earth. This fed superstition and denial in equal measure. Some blamed wild animals. Others blamed the women themselves, saying they must have run away or made bad choices. That blame created silence, and silence protected the truth. It wasn't until much later, when survivors came forward, that the reality emerged. They spoke of how quickly things happened, how the roads they trusted became traps. They described the brothers' calm voices, the way they seemed to know exactly where to stand, where to move. The mountains weren't just scenery, they were part of the system. Every curve in the road, every thicket of trees had been memorized, rehearsed, weaponized. Looking back, investigators realized the disappearances were never random. They followed a chilling logic shaped by geography and opportunity. The brothers didn't need to travel far or act loudly. They let the land do the work for them. And because the victims vanished one by one, spread across time and terrain, it took far too long for anyone to connect the dots. By the time the pattern became undeniable, too many women were already gone. The roads that once symbolized freedom and independence had become corridors of fear. And the mountains, ancient and unmoving, had silently watched it all, holding secrets in their folds, while an entire community struggled to understand how something so terrible could happen right beside them. Without anyone seeing it coming, from the outside, the barn looked like nothing more than a forgotten structure slowly surrendering to time. Its boards were warped and sun-bleached, its roof sagged in places, and weeds choked the ground around it. In Appalachia, barns like that were everywhere. Remnants of failed farms, abandoned when the land stopped giving back. To anyone passing by, it was invisible in the most dangerous way: ordinary. That ordinariness was its greatest disguise. The barn sat just far enough from the farmhouse to seem unused, tucked behind a rise in the land and partially shielded by dense trees. From the road, it was barely visible. Even if someone noticed it, there was nothing to suggest it held anything of value, let alone something horrific. No fresh paint, no lights, no sounds. Just a quiet structure blending into the landscape. And that was exactly how the brothers wanted it. What no one realized was that the barn had been altered over years, slowly and deliberately. Survivors would later describe how the brothers reinforced the interior while letting the exterior decay. Inside, the walls were lined with additional boards to muffle sound. Gaps were sealed. Chains and restraints were hidden behind loose planks. The floor had been strengthened in places, weakened in others. It wasn't built all at once. It evolved, shaped by practice, by experimentation, by cruelty refined over time. Sound was the barn's greatest secret. The surrounding forest absorbed noise in a way that felt almost intentional. Wind through the trees masked cries. Animals called out at night, blurring the line between natural and human sound. Even if someone had screamed at full force, the odds of it carrying far enough to reach a neighbor were slim. And on the rare occasion a sound did travel, it was easy to dismiss. Appalachia was full of strange noises, foxes that screamed like women, owls that cried like children. People told themselves comforting lies. The brothers relied on another powerful shield assumption. Everyone assumed the barn was empty. Everyone assumed it was unsafe, collapsing, not worth entering. Children were warned to stay away because it might fall apart. Adults had no reason to go near it. That assumption created a boundary stronger than any lock. No one checked inside because no one believed there was anything to check. The barn's location also allowed control. Once inside, the world effectively disappeared. Light barely entered through the narrow slats. Time lost meaning. Survivors later said they couldn't tell whether hours or days had passed. The isolation broke resistance faster than violence ever could. The barn wasn't just a holding place. It was a tool designed to disorient, to dominate, to erase any sense of rescue or escape. What made the situation even more horrifying was how close it all was to normal life. The brothers continued their routines. They went into town. They spoke to neighbors. They bought supplies, all while women were held just a short distance away, hidden behind rotting wood and silence. The contrast was unbearable in hindsight, brutality existing inches away from normalcy. undetected because no one imagined such evil could exist in such a familiar place. There were moments when discovery came terrifyingly close. A delivery driver once stopped near the property and commented on hearing something strange, a muffled noise that didn't quite sound like an animal. One of the brothers laughed it off, saying the barn was infested with raccoons. The explanation fit the setting, fit expectations, and the man left without another thought. Another time, a storm damaged part of the roof, and a neighbor offered to help repair it. The brothers refused immediately, their politeness sharp and final. The refusal itself should have raised alarms, but in a region where privacy was sacred, it didn't. Inside the barn, hope came and went in waves. Survivors described how the brothers used the space to control not just bodies, but minds. The darkness made people compliant. The silence made them doubt themselves. The barn became the center of the brothers' power, a place where they felt untouchable, protected by isolation, geography, and disbelief. It was where their crimes escalated, growing more organized, more confident, more monstrous. The most chilling detail came later, when investigators finally entered the barn. At first glance, it still looked abandoned. But once inside, the truth revealed itself in layers. Scratches on the walls, notches carved into beams, personal items hidden under loose floorboards, pieces of lives that had been cut short or stolen away. The barn had been a prison, but also a grave for hope. Every mark told a story of someone who had believed escape was possible, even for a moment. The question that haunted the community afterward was simple and devastating. How could something like this exist without anyone knowing? The answer lay not in ignorance alone, but in familiarity. People saw the barn every day and stopped really seeing it. It faded into the background, just another structure in a landscape full of forgotten things. And in that blindness, the brothers found freedom. When the truth finally came out, the barn was no longer just a building. It became a symbol of how evil doesn't always hide in shadows or distant places. Sometimes it sits quietly in plain sight, weathered and ignored, protected not by locks or guards, but by the comforting belief that nothing truly terrible could be happening there. In the Appalachian Mountains, that belief allowed a nightmare to exist undisturbed, hidden behind rotting wood and silence, until the damage was already done. When the truth finally began to surface, it did not come from confessions or sudden discoveries by authorities. It came from the survivors, the few women who lived long enough, escaped by chance, or were released when the brothers believed they were broken beyond repair. Their testimonies were fragmented, shaken, and often delivered through tears, but together they formed a picture far darker than anyone in the region had imagined. What shocked investigators most was not just what the brothers did, but how methodical and calculated their control had been. Survivors described how the brothers never relied solely on physical force. Violence was used, but it was never random. It was precise, timed, and purposeful. Every action was designed to strip away autonomy, identity, and hope. From the moment a woman was taken, the brothers worked to convince her that escape was impossible, and that no one was looking for her. Many survivors spoke about the psychological tactics used inside the barn. The brothers controlled light and sound carefully. Sometimes they would leave the captives in complete darkness for hours or days. Other times, they would suddenly flood the space with light, shouting questions, demanding obedience. The unpredictability kept the women in a constant state of fear and confusion. Survivors later said they stopped trusting their own sense of time, their own memories, even their own thoughts. Isolation was another weapon. The women were rarely allowed to see one another clearly. When they did, it was often briefly, just enough to remind them they were not alone, and then to take that comfort away again. The brothers understood that solidarity could lead to resistance. By keeping captives separated, they prevented bonds from forming, turning loneliness into a form of control. Survivors said the silence was sometimes worse than the pain. The brothers also manipulated basic human needs. Food and water were given inconsistently, sometimes withheld, sometimes offered as a reward. This created a twisted dependency where captives began to associate survival itself with compliance. Survivors later struggled with guilt, haunted by the things they felt forced to do just to stay alive. Investigators would later emphasize that these reactions were not weakness, but the result of systematic coercion. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the testimonies was how ordinary the brothers appeared during these acts. Survivors described moments when one brother would casually talk about the weather, farming, or town gossip while holding complete control over another human being's life. That casual cruelty, the absence of rage or chaos, made the situation feel unreal. Several survivors said that disconnect broke them faster than violence ever could. It made them realize the brothers felt no remorse, no urgency, no fear of being caught. One woman described how she attempted to scream during her first night in the barn, only to be calmly told it didn't matter. One of the brothers opened the door slightly, letting her hear the sounds of the forest, insects, wind, distant animals, and then closed it again. "No one can tell the difference," he said. That moment stayed with her for years. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact, and it crushed any remaining belief that help was coming. Another survivor spoke about how the brothers controlled names and identity. They refused to use real names, assigning numbers or cruel nicknames instead. Over time, captives began to respond automatically, even internally. Investigators later noted how survivors struggled to say their own names during interviews, pausing as if reaching for something buried deep. That loss of identity was one of the most lasting scars. The testimonies also revealed how escape attempts were handled. The brothers did not immediately punish everyone when someone resisted. Instead, they made examples. Survivors described being forced to listen as another woman was punished, knowing it was meant as a warning. The cruelty was calculated to spread fear without constant action. Silence became compliance. Stillness became survival. What made the testimonies even more powerful was their consistency. These women had never met before their captivity, yet their stories aligned in chilling detail. The layout of the barn, the routines, the phrases the brothers used, the sounds at night. The investigators realized they were not hearing exaggerated trauma. They were hearing the same truth repeated from different mouths. When these testimonies were finally presented publicly, the community struggled to accept them. Many people had known the brothers for years. They were quiet, reserved, helpful at times. The idea that such calculated cruelty existed behind familiar faces was deeply unsettling. Some residents initially tried to dismiss the survivors as confused or mistaken. But the details were too precise, too consistent, too real to ignore. For the survivors, speaking out came at a cost. Reliving the trauma reopened wounds that never fully healed. Some faced disbelief. Others faced whispers and avoidance. Yet they spoke anyway, driven by a need to make sure the truth could not be buried again. They wanted the barn to lose its power. They wanted the silence broken. In the end, their testimonies did more than expose a crime. They revealed how control can exist without chains being visible, how isolation can become a weapon, and how evil can thrive when people assume they would notice if something was wrong. The survivors' voices turned a hidden nightmare into undeniable reality. And once spoken aloud, the truth could no longer be ignored, no matter how deeply the community wished it could return to believing the barn was empty. The investigation did not begin with certainty or confidence. It began with confusion, scattered reports, and a growing unease that something was deeply wrong but impossible to clearly define. For years, women had gone missing across the Appalachian region without any obvious connection. Some vanished while traveling alone, others after last being seen near small towns or isolated roads. Each case was treated separately, dismissed as runaways, accidents, or tragedies of the mountains themselves. It wasn't until a survivor spoke, hesitant, terrified, but determined, that authorities began to see a pattern forming. At first, investigators struggled to take the claims seriously. The idea that two brothers could be responsible for so many disappearances, operating undetected in such a close-knit region, seemed implausible. But the survivor knew details she shouldn't have known. She described the barn's interior with unsettling accuracy. She recalled specific phrases used by the brothers, habits they repeated, routines that never changed. These weren't vague memories shaped by fear. They were concrete, verifiable facts. As detectives began reviewing old missing persons files, the connections became impossible to ignore. The dates overlapped. The locations clustered around the same rural routes. Witness descriptions, once thought meaningless, suddenly aligned. A woman seen accepting a ride from two men. Another last spotted near a farm matching the brothers' property. A shopkeeper's memory of supplies purchased in bulk at strange intervals. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it formed a chilling narrative. The breakthrough came when investigators visited the property under the guise of a routine inquiry. The brothers were calm, cooperative on the surface, almost relieved to have company. But small inconsistencies emerged. Their stories didn't quite match. Timelines shifted. One brother answered questions meant for the other, correcting details too quickly. Experienced detectives recognized the signs, not panic, but control. The kind that comes from believing you're smarter than everyone else. When authorities requested permission to inspect the barn, the mood changed. The refusal was polite but firm, justified by claims of structural danger. That refusal alone wasn't enough for a warrant, but it added weight to the growing suspicion. Investigators returned to town and worked through the night, gathering affidavits, survivor testimony, and historical complaints that had never gone anywhere. By morning, they had enough. The day the warrant was executed, officers expected resistance, maybe anger, maybe denial. What they didn't expect was silence. The brothers said very little as law enforcement approached the barn. No shouting, no pleading. Just a tense stillness, as if they already knew the game was over. When the doors were finally forced open, the truth revealed itself slowly, horrifyingly. Inside, investigators found evidence that matched survivor testimony down to the smallest detail. restraints hidden behind boards, marks on the walls where people had scratched, clawed, counted days, personal belongings buried under hay and loose planks, shoes, hair ribbons, scraps of clothing, things no one would abandon willingly. The barn stopped being a rumor and became a crime scene, one that told its story without words. As the investigation expanded, forensic teams uncovered traces that linked the brothers directly to multiple disappearances. DNA evidence, fibers, and items tied to missing women sealed the case. Old assumptions crumbled under new facts. What the community had believed for years, that the mountains simply swallowed people, was replaced by the realization that evil had been operating openly, shielded by familiarity and disbelief. The brothers were arrested and charged, and with each new revelation, the scope of their crimes grew. More survivors came forward. Some had lived for years in silence, convinced no one would believe them. Others had buried memories so deeply they only surfaced when they saw the news. Each statement added another layer to the investigation, turning suspicion into undeniable truth. The most devastating moment came when families of the missing were informed. For years, they had lived with uncertainty, hoping for miracles, blaming themselves, questioning every decision. Now they had answers, but answers that brought no comfort. Knowing what had happened didn't bring peace. It brought grief, anger, and a haunting question: could this have been stopped sooner? As the trial unfolded, the investigation became a mirror held up to the entire region. Authorities were forced to confront their own failures, reports that had been ignored, tips dismissed as exaggeration, assumptions made because the accused didn't seem like that kind of people. The brothers hadn't just exploited isolation, they had exploited trust. In the end, the investigation did more than connect disappearances to one family. It exposed how easily patterns can be overlooked when fear is more comfortable than truth. It showed how predators can hide behind normalcy and how communities can unknowingly protect them by refusing to imagine the worst. The case became a warning, etched into local memory. Sometimes the danger isn't out there in the wilderness. Sometimes it's rooted in a place everyone thought they knew. When the barn was finally sealed and the property abandoned, it stood as a silent monument to everything that had gone unnoticed. The investigation was over, the evidence catalogued, the guilty named. But the impact lingered. Every road felt different. Every abandoned structure carried new weight, and the community would never again assume that disappearances had no connection. Because once the truth was uncovered, it was impossible to forget how long it had taken to see what was there all along. The moment the truth became public, it felt as though the region collectively stopped breathing. News spread faster than anyone expected, carried by local radio, whispered phone calls, and stunned conversations at grocery stores and church steps. What had once been rumor hardened into fact. The disappearances were real, the barn was real, and the brothers were responsible. The reign of terror didn't end with a dramatic chase or a final scream, but with something quieter and more unsettling. The sudden collapse of a lie everyone had unknowingly helped maintain. In the days immediately following the discovery, law enforcement secured the property and sealed off the barn. Investigators worked carefully, documenting every detail, knowing the weight of what they were handling. Each item recovered was treated with reverence, not just as evidence, but as proof that the victims had existed, had suffered, and had not been forgotten. The process was slow and methodical, and with every hour, the scope of the crimes became harder to deny. As arrests were announced, shock turned into disbelief, and disbelief into anger. People who had known the brothers struggled to reconcile the men they remembered with the reality now exposed. Some felt guilt for not seeing signs. Others felt defensive, insisting there had been no way to know. That internal conflict fractured the community. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Long-standing friendships grew tense. The sense of safety people once took for granted evaporated almost overnight. For survivors, the end of the brothers' control did not mean the end of their suffering. Freedom came tangled with fear. Many were afraid to leave their homes, haunted by the idea that the world could hide horrors so easily. Some relocated quietly, unable to bear staying in a place that held so many memories. Others stayed and chose to testify, knowing it would reopen wounds, but believing silence was no longer an option. Their courage shifted the narrative from one of victimhood to one of undeniable strength. The legal process stretched on, heavy and exhausting. Courtrooms filled with family members of the missing, survivors, journalists, and locals who came simply to see the truth with their own eyes. Testimonies were delivered in trembling voices. Evidence was presented piece by piece, each detail stripping away any remaining doubt. The brothers sat through it all, their composure cracking only slightly, as if even now they struggled to accept that the power they once held had vanished. When verdicts were finally delivered, there was no celebration. There was relief, yes, a collective exhale, but also an overwhelming grief for what could never be undone. Justice felt incomplete, because justice could not restore lost years, lost lives, or lost trust. Families of the missing were left with answers, but also with the unbearable knowledge of what those answers meant. Closure remained an elusive concept. In the aftermath, the barn became a point of contention. Some wanted it destroyed immediately, erased from the landscape, as if that could erase the memory. Others argued it should remain, marked and sealed, a warning for future generations. In the end, it was dismantled quietly, its materials disposed of under supervision, its physical presence removed, but its legacy impossible to erase. The land itself felt changed, as if the mountains had absorbed the truth and would never fully let it go. The case also forced changes within local law enforcement. New procedures were introduced for handling missing persons reports. Tips were no longer dismissed as easily. Officers received additional training on recognizing patterns of coercive control and long-term captivity. The investigation became a reference point in criminal studies, cited as an example of how crimes can persist when assumptions replace scrutiny. Perhaps the most lasting impact was psychological. The community learned a painful lesson: familiarity does not equal safety. Ordinary appearances can hide extraordinary cruelty. People became more attentive, more willing to question what they once ignored. Abandoned structures were no longer just background scenery. Silence was no longer comforting. It became something to listen to carefully. Survivors continued to rebuild their lives in different ways. Some spoke publicly, determined to turn their pain into prevention. Others chose privacy, healing quietly beyond the reach of headlines. All carried scars that time could soften, but never fully erase. Yet their survival itself became a form of defiance, proof that the brothers' control had not been absolute, that their victims were more than what had been done to them. Years later, the story still lingers in Appalachian memory. not as a legend exaggerated over time, but as a sober reminder of what happens when people assume someone else will notice, someone else will act, someone else will question. The reign of terror ended not with heroics, but with truth finally being seen and believed. And in that truth lies the warning that echoes through the mountains. Still, evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly, counting on the world to look away.